Bobby towards the Frightbox recording here. So in a world where we're always chasing the latest and greatest amp modeler, whether it's the newest Kemper, newest AxeFX, one of the 5 billion amp sim plugins that are out there, how does something like the Pod X3 from 2008 hold up? Now it's funny, when it comes to real amps, there are classics. The JCM 800, the PV5150, the Mesa Dual triple rectifiers, and no one ever questions those. But why are we always upgrading our amp modelers? Are the newest ones that are out there really that much better than what was available in 2008? Now, I worked at a music store when I was a kid, and I remember back in the late 90s first seeing amp modelers, and they all supposedly sounded like a real amp. And here we are 20 years later, and they're still claiming they sound like a real amp. Well, if they sounded like a real amp back then, how do these sound more like a real amp? It doesn't really make sense. Now, I know modelers like the Kemper are really powerful and can actually profile your tube heads, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about if dusty old amp modelers like this from 2008 are usable within a pro level production. Now, me personally, I haven't used one of these in ages, so what I decided to do to test this is take an old demo that I had lying around, take the DI tracks and reamp them through the Pod X3 in order to see if it's possible to get a usable tone out of this thing. And if that usable tone sounds good. All right, so here we are in my home office, which is where I'm performing this experiment. Super simple. All I'm doing is reamping some DIs through my pod with the help of my reamp box. All I have is my 2-channel interface, but that's all I need. The amp model that I'm using on my Pod X3 is the 2001 tread plate dual, which is just a model of the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, and I'm just using the 4x12 tread plate cab with it. And I'm using an SM57 model on Access. And here's a visual of my EQ settings that I'm using on the amp model, very basic. I'm also running a virtual tube screamer within the Pod X3 itself. So all the tone that you're gonna be hearing in this sample is coming straight from the Pod X3, just straight 2008 Pod X3. So what I've done here is I took an old demo of mine, which were just a couple of DI tracks, and these are the actual DI tracks. I ran each of them through the Pod X3 just to see if I could come up with a usable tone that can actually be used within a pro level production. I like the 2001 tread plate the best out of all the amp models for what I go for, which is just a nice balanced metal tone. So I did a quick mix here, nothing crazy, and let's see how it sounds. So there you have it. That is just the Pod X3 with nothing fancy happening. And in my opinion, that's more than usable. And again, we're using an amp modeler here from 2008. Now, like I was saying previously, people obsess over buying the latest and greatest. And while I have nothing against it, again, a lot of these newer amp modelers have some great features like the profiling features, but you could pick something up like the Pod X3 for dirt cheap on eBay or on the used market. So now as far as the mix goes, super simple. I had these 2 DI tracks. I'm actually going to solo these. Yeah, I had those 2 DI tracks and I reamped them one at a time through the Pod X3. And here is the Pod X3 tone soloed. Yeah, nothing crazy. I just have a little bit of C4 multiband just controlling the palm mutes as per usual, just like I would do on any other tone, even if it were a real amp. And a little bit of EQ. I'm just high passing up to about 80 hertz, rolling off everything above 12K, and then a little bit of notching here and there, nothing more than a dB and a half in the upper mids and the lower mids. That's it. And the reason why you see no EQ happening on the tracks themselves is because I have my 2 pod tracks being bussed to my guitar submix, and that's where I have my processing happening. The DIs are doing absolutely nothing. They're both zeroed out and aren't being used. They were only used for reamping. And actually, I want to mention this. I'm going to play the guitar solo for a second once more. actually didn't reamp the guitar solos through the Pod X3, mainly because I never reamp guitar solos because, in my opinion, the bulk of your production sound really comes from the rhythm guitars. And actually, rhythm guitar tone is way harder to dial in than lead guitar tone, in my opinion. And just to further demonstrate my point that you don't need to use fancy equipment to get great results, here is my fancy pants lead guitar tone. It's just a stock SansAmp plugin in Pro Tools, which is nothing fancy, a cheapo Tube Screamer emulator by Waves, a stock Pro Tools EQ, and a stock Pro Tools compressor. That is all. But in the context of the mix, even though the lead guitar tone isn't anything fancy, it sounds right because the rhythms sound great. And this entire rhythm tone is generated by a Pod X3. Dusty old amp modeler that most people wouldn't even think to use these days. And again, once more, let's listen to it from the beginning and check it out. Here we go. So there you have it. Home recording technology has been great for well over a decade. I know it's easy to have shiny object syndrome and always want the latest and greatest, but you really don't need it. What you have is more than likely good enough. Like I always say, learning how to use your tools is more important than the tools themselves. So with that being said, if you see a Pod X3 up for sale for dirt cheap, I would suggest if you don't have a decent amp modeler, pick one up. Because as you can hear, it's more than capable of producing great tones that you can use in any professional metal production. Okay, so as you can see, this thing is more than usable. And we're talking about a 12-year-old amp modeler. It's crazy, I see guitar players online always looking to upgrade their amp modeler. Oh, if I have a Kemper, I'm gonna switch to an AxeFX. If I have an AxeFX, I'm gonna switch to a Kemper. Oh, I'm gonna switch to the Helix. Oh, I need to go with bias effects. People are quick to spend money without actually learning how to use the tools that they already have. Now, if I were able to dial in a decent tone out of this dated, dusty old amp modeler, I think you could get a great tone out of your AxeFX. I know because I use AxeFXs and Kempers all the time. I like them, but they are not the end-all be-all. As consumers, we're really eager to jump onto the next latest and greatest thing, but that's not always the best way to go, especially when your primary objective should be to improve your productions. Now again, if I can get something decent out of this, I'm sure you can get something decent on whatever you have at home. And I didn't even have to do anything crazy in the mix, just a minimal amount of EQ, just like I would have to do on an actual live amp, and it sounds more than good enough. So at the end of the day, it's like I always say, it's how you use the tools, not the tools themselves. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon in order to be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And if you'd like, you could download my free guitar cab impulse response of my favorite Mesa Boogie cab out of my studio. There's a link below, right within this video's description. Till next time, happy guitar recording.